Here we go. So some agenda items real quick to go through, some budgeting obstacles. We'll go through the expenditures, looking at those year over year, the changes. We'll look at the potential tax impact. Remember, this is the proposed final budget, not the final. I want to talk a little bit about federal grants because that has been a hot topic. And then, of course, the next steps in the process. There we go. So some of the obstacles, seems like same issues, but only different. The state budget was put forth, or at least the proposed state budget was put forth by the governor a month and a half ago. It's not done yet. So we don't have any final numbers, of course, on our education subsidies, transportation, and so on down the list. So that always adds a bit of a question mark. Also, any mandated reforms. We've heard in the past about property tax reform. We've heard a little bit this year about potential charter school reform. We don't know if any of those are going to press forward or not. So that adds a question mark. And also federal spending and grants. Historically, federal revenues are a very minor part. They still continue to be, but there are some interesting things going on from some of the relief packages that have been passed. And of course, the COVID spending is also an issue that we're going to talk about a little bit too. So looking at the expense side of our ledger, as always has been, the wages and benefits constitute about 70% of our total budget overall. Salaries and wages going into the coming year overall, we're looking at approximately from professional, 1.7 million increase. This is just organic growth. Overall, the professional wage is about almost 1.3 million in additional spending. Overall, admin and support about 450,000. Included in those numbers are new needs at the district. So perhaps additional personnel about 820,000, professional about 156,000 of support. The related tax and benefits that go with that. The PSERS, as it does every year, thankfully not as big of a jump as usual. The PSERS percentages has gone up from 34.51% to 34.94%. When you do all the math as that relates to everything, it comes out to about 1.163 million in increase there. Our medical coverage, about 5% increase. We just did our second look with Ruskini. And those are how those numbers are flushing out currently. Payroll taxes, at least our share, about 107,000. That's on the wages and benefits portion of our expenses. And then looking at the other ones that go below the personnel costs are some increases here. Charter school tuition, we increased about 700,000. We're looking at, as we spoke about in Finance Committee in the past, about a $900,000 to $1 million increase this current year, basically because of COVID. Our special ed services, about 500,000. That's not terribly out of the norm due to some higher needs. One of the big items in here is replacing deferred funding from prior years. You recall last year, we slowed the reserves for facilities and for curriculum. We need to put those back in, and we need to cover what we took out. So that equals about 1.5 million. Our Western Center tuition up about 130,000, which to me is actually a good thing. It means our kids are participating in those programs. That's how that's figured out. It's as it's used. Canvas and Zoom was not in our budget last year because it was late in the game. About 100,000 there. Transportation and fuel, about $500,000 there as we see the prices of fuel rising, and we're also working through our renegotiating of that contract, or I should say, renegotiating our renewal of that contract. And then, of course, some of our self-funding initiatives to replenish those over the next number of years for tech purchases we just approved. That's about 400,000. So overall, about 3.48 million there. So if we look at the comparative year over year, what we're seeing is, this is how it lays out, about $172 million in expenditures last year versus organic growth of about 179, almost 180 million this coming year. I like to look all the way down at the lower right-hand corner, which says our expenses would be growing year over year at about 4.3, 4.4%. Moving on to the revenue side of the ledger, just so everyone understands, local revenue, property tax, earned income tax, and such, those make up almost 80% of our total revenue sources. The state is about 21%, and the federal consistently is around 1%. We're looking at organic growth in our real estate taxes, which is about a 1.5% year over year. So that is about almost 1.7 million in increase there. Earned income tax, we've, based on trends, we've bumped that up from 10,300,000 to 11 million, which is supported by the past year trends. And then we're looking at a decline of about a little over $100,000 in delinquent collections, simply because inventory is going down and the timing of such. From the state side, we're looking at a basic education funding subsidy increase of about 800,000, transportation about 200,000, and increases in the offset for retirement and employer taxes of about $500 million. On the federal side, we're looking at, last year we got a nice surprise, but an increase in some of our title funding and our medical access funding. So we're expecting the same as we got towards the end of last year. Unfortunately, those numbers come out in the late May, June timeframe. So those are usually past when we're ready to go, but we're looking that that's gonna mirror that. So if we look at the revenues year over year, side by side, this is what we're looking at here. So the interesting thing to me about these charts is when you look, again, down to the lower right-hand corner, I see revenues increasing, call it around 2.5% versus the 4.3% we saw our expenditures increasing. So there's an issue to always keep an eye on there. So when I look at the proposed final budget gap and where we stand as of right now, this is the simple math. It shows us that the net shortfall is of almost $4 million, $3.967 million, which would equate to a tax impact of about 3.5%. As you guys know, or as you folks know, the index is 3%. So we need to get down at least to that point, which is what we talked about at our last board meeting, the direction we received. So we'll be working on that. Now, I did say that I wanted to take a couple of minutes just to talk about federal grants. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I've heard comments and so forth, some on record, some off record, that we're being flooded with all this money through these relief or programs to get the economy going and such, that we're being flooded with this money from the feds. And I wanted to make sure folks know that federal grants are great when you can spend them, and they're very difficult to spend. We look at, all items are subject to the most stringent procurement rules, bidding, protection bids, and that's according to the Uniform Grant Guidance, that we must take whichever is stricter, the state level or the federal level. So my team is constantly looking on that. Also, I think it's important to note they can only be used for COVID-related things. They cannot be used for budget-related, normal budget operations-related things. So some things that it can be used for: learning loss mitigation, academic assessments, some new equipment or purchases for initiatives relating to COVID. So some of the things that we have done, we've been able to use some federal money. For example, recently the board approved bottle filling stations throughout the district. We're able to apply that because that is a direct correlation back to COVID. So we do a hands-free water system, right? But some things that it cannot be used for, which is revenue loss. So if a district saw a big decline in their earned income tax, for example, thankfully we did not, we could not use that money to replace that revenue that was lost. Can't use it for normal year-over-year operating, can't use it for our charter expenses. So the numerous calls that I've been on and my team has been on with the IU, with the PASBO, with state representatives has been, or representatives from the state, not our state representatives, has been that the increases, while I can substantiate that they're directly due to COVID, because they started going up on September 1st of this past year dramatically, I cannot use federal money to cover that bridge. I have not yet seen that in writing in the grant, so I'm going to look at that further, but as it stands right now, that has been what's communicated. And finally on that, I want to let the board know that these funds are non-recurring. So one day they dry up. That day is either by the time they're all spent or September of 2023, whichever comes first. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to be put into a position like what happened in the state back in 2010 to 2012, when there was all this stimulus money that folks seemed to be budgeting for at one point, that it would continue, and then all of a sudden it was gone. Next thing you know, you have very large budget gaps. Finally, I just want to look at our next steps, where we are. So today, obviously the presentation, there's an action item on the board agenda for this evening to adopt the proposed final budget. Again, there's still work to be done, and it will be done. On April 13th, that's tomorrow, the Finance Committee will meet and we'll go through the targets that were established by the board last time we met, which was about 3%, I think was the target. And we'll work towards balancing the budget as we are required to do by law, and of course we do every year. May 4th, we'll make the proposed final, or earlier, we'll make the proposed final budget, which is something we're required to do by law, on the Pennsylvania Form 2028. On May 14th, we'll publish the intent to adopt, and if all things go the way they should go, on May 24th, we'll have the budget ready for adoption by the board. Are there any questions or comments for me?
I have a couple of questions, Mr. Fink.
Yes.
Canvas and Zoom, are they covered as part of in the federal grant money?
Yes.
I thought I did see that somewhere, but then I saw
Yes,
another
they will be.
place.
Yeah, they will be. It was put on the expense side of the ledger, and I also included it on the federal side of the ledger, the federal revenue side of the ledger too. So yes, they will be.
And what has been spent, ballpark of that federal money that's been awarded to us, so to speak? What has been spent?
I believe last I looked, we'll definitely be going over that tomorrow evening, about 1.3 million, I believe.